Richard, you're very welcome. You are going to introduce us to one of the major theological forces of the modern world, Schopenhauer, and you're going to try and introduce how Schopenhauer relates to the issue of the human person. So you're welcome, and you're welcome.
Thank you, Tom. I mean, perhaps can I just say why I think Schopenhauer is important, particularly for me. That's right. Because I've got three areas of my research. One of them is in the theology of Paul. The other one is the theology of Richard Wagner and theology of music. And the third one is the issues of science and theology. And the thing that brings all those things together is this figure of Arthur Schopenhauer. So, for example, I've done this article in the Journal for the Study of Paul and His Letters, which is reading Romans with Arthur Schopenhauer. So it's relating Schopenhauer to the theology of Paul. Secondly, a book that came out last year on Wagner's Parsifal, and that's got quite a lot about Schopenhauer in it as well. And then I wrote this book, and this is about the devil, called Deliver Us from Evil. And I try to form some sort of framework to understand language about the devil. And there's quite a lot of Arthur Schopenhauer in this as well. So for me, he's managed to bring together these three areas of my research. So Schopenhauer and the human person. Let me just say something about Schopenhauer first of all. He was a German philosopher. Now, he actually wrote in German, and I stress that because, of course, before him, Germans were often writing in Latin, usually writing in Latin, so he'd write in German. But he was a German who took an interest in many different cultures. Now, he was born in Danzig, that's just on the coast of the Baltic, and that corresponds now to Gdansk, now in Poland. So he was born in Danzig in 1788. And he spent most of the second half of his life in Frankfurt, and he died there in Frankfurt in 1860. Now, he took an interest in many different cultures. So first of all, he took an interest in European cultures. So as a boy, he would move around Europe. Perhaps I can just emphasize that he spent some time in England, and he even went to a boarding school in Wimbledon for a few weeks, which he found absolutely ghastly. But the very interesting thing is that he was always a lover of the English people and the English culture. So he often used to read the Times, for example, in later life. He could speak very good English. In fact, he would often boast that people would not know he was a German because his English was so good, his accent was so good, and he could write English very, very well. So he loved English, the English culture. He adored Shakespeare. In fact, he thought that Shakespeare was the greatest dramatist of all time. But what is very, very interesting, that although he loved the English culture, he hated the Anglican Church. And one reason he hated the Anglican Church is that the boarding school he went to was actually a Church of England foundation. So he loved the English culture, and he knew a lot about the French culture. Now, as well as all this interest in the European cultures, he knew quite a lot about Eastern religions as well. So he took an interest in Buddhism and Hinduism, for example. And in fact, of all the world religions, he wrote that he thought that Buddhism was actually the finest religion. I actually would question that, because I think he admired Christianity quite a lot as well. But I don't think he was so open about this. So that was his interest in a whole range of cultures. He was obviously interested in the arts. I mean, he would read a lot. So he loved painting as well. He loved music. Obviously, he loved Goethe. As I say, he loved Shakespeare as well. And the next significant thing is that he took an interest in the sciences. And I think this is very, very significant, because I think a lot of philosophers that theologians call upon, especially in the last, say, 100 years, many of these philosophers know virtually nothing about science. But Schopenhauer took a deep interest in science, as did Immanuel Kant, of course. So when Schopenhauer went to university, now he didn't go to university until he was 21, So he's what we would almost call a mature student. When he first went to university in Göttingen, he actually enrolled to study medicine. So he took a number of modules, as would say, or courses in medical sciences and other sciences. And it wasn't until his second year that he started going to philosophy courses. And then when he left Göttingen, he later went to Berlin, and then he followed up philosophy, so he studied there with Fichte. So I think it's very, very significant that he took an interest in the sciences. He obviously took an interest in religion as well. So in the Christian religion, he was particularly drawn to St. Paul, Augustine and Luther. And one reason for this is that all these theologians stressed very much predestination, and this chimed in very much with Schopenhauer's deterministic view of the world. So he admired them for that, and he also admired them because they stressed the bondage of the will. So for example, he loved Luther's treatise of 1525 on the bondage of the will. And again, that chimed in very much with Schopenhauer's worldview. And then the last thing I want to say in the background information is that he stressed very much the suffering of the world. So he wrote an essay on the suffering of the world. In his writings, he's often talking about suffering. And you wonder, well, why is this? In fact, when you look at his life, he had a very difficult life. His father died when Schopenhauer was around about 18 years old, and it's widely believed that his father actually committed suicide. So that was obviously a trauma for him. He had a very difficult relationship with his mother, and in fact, he often had arguments. And there was one instance where he had such a bad argument with his mother that his mother just left the house, and she then left a note for him saying, "I'm going to disown you, you're actually no good for my mental health." And so she actually abandoned him, and he never saw her again for the rest of her life. And in fact, he never went to her funeral. Now, Schopenhauer was probably a difficult child, but obviously this was major trauma to be abandoned by your mother. And then his love life was pretty disastrous as well. He had relationships with women, but they never really worked out. And in fact, he fathered 2 children with 2 different women, and both children died in infancy. So he had a very, very difficult life. So that just gives you some background to his work. Now, his major work is called The World as Will and Representation. And this came out in 1818, 1819, and this was his major work. And it went through 3 editions. And in this work, he was basically building upon Immanuel Kant and Plato. He thought that Plato and Immanuel Kant were the towering figures in philosophy. And so he was building upon their philosophy. Now, Schopenhauer said that Kant's major contribution was making this distinction between the world as phenomena, or as Kant would say, appearance, Erscheinung, and the thing in itself. So this is the fundamental thing he took from Immanuel Kant. And so Schopenhauer said, the world, on the one hand, is my representation. And the German word for that, quite an important word, is Vorstellung. So for example, we're in this theatre now, and we're forming representations of various things. And Schopenhauer would say that when we form these representations, we're actually imposing certain things on our experience. And he simplified Kant's scheme, and he said there were 3 fundamental things we impose. First of all, the space, there's time, and then there's causality. And he always talked about this subject-object relationship. So I, as subject, am now forming a representation of this theatre. So the representation is what you'd call the Vorstellung. So this is what he built upon Kant. Now, when Kant was talking about the thing in itself, Kant would say, this is something that we can never really know. And Kant said the thing in itself.
Yeah, and we should start. That's the Ding an sich.
The Ding an sich. The Ding an sich, that's right. So Kant would say the thing in itself, das Ding an sich, that is something we can never know. And he actually referred to it as a Grenzbegriff, a limiting concept. So we form this world, as Kant would often talk about, the Erscheinung, the appearance. But, so to speak, the thing behind that, the thing in itself, we can never know. Now, Schopenhauer actually then started questioning that. And the way he did it was very, very interesting. And what he did, he said, well, let's take the human body. Let's say I'm holding a pen, I'm writing on a piece of paper, and then he says, let's say I sort of like turn the page and then I cut my hand and then there's a cut. Well, I'm actually forming a representation, a Vorstellung. So that is the world as representation. But he said, you can actually look inside yourself. And if you actually look inside yourself, you're not really talking about representation as you would in the world out there. And so he saw this sort of correspondence between your body and what he called your will. And he said that the body and the will are one. Not that they're identical, but it's almost like two sides of the same, of the one coin. And so he came up with this view that the will does not cause the body, rather the body is simply a manifestation of that will. It's very, very interesting because when you go back to Kant, Kant had possibly a problem here because he talked about the thing in itself and he talked about the fact that this causes the world of appearance. And many people said, for example, Schultz, he said, well, how can this possibly be? Because you can't talk about causality when you're talking about the thing in itself. So how can the thing in itself cause this world of appearance? And Schopenhauer managed to get round that by saying, actually, the body is a manifestation of the will. And so this is how he developed his view of the world as will and representation.
Richard, thank you for that wonderful introduction to the anthropology of Schopenhauer. Thank you.